Come to the fountain, dip your heart in the stream of life. Let the pain and the sorrow be washed away in the waves of his mercy, as deep cries out to deep. Come, Lord Jesus. Come, Lord Jesus. Come, Lord Jesus.
Hello. Thank you for joining us for our Jesus for Newbies Bible study. This is lesson 5. We left last week. God had made this promise to Abram. He told Abram that from his family he would build a great nation, and from that nation all the people of the earth would be blessed. So these are two prophecies. The first prophecy predicts the nation of Israel. Abram was going to have a son named Isaac. Isaac was going to have a son named Jacob. Jacob's name would be changed to Israel. His children would make up the tribes of Israel, and his family would become a great nation. The second part of that promise, that prophecy, was that by his family, all the people of the world would be blessed. That would happen through the Messiah, through Jesus. This was a promise that the nation of Israel would be this incubator and a thing to preserve faith, but also to preserve that family line. And Jacob's son Judah would be the great-great-great-great-grandfather of Jesus. So let's go to Genesis chapter 37, verse 18. Now, Jacob had sons. And you know, if you have a dysfunctional family, if your family doesn't quite work as well as other families, I just want you to understand Jacob's family was dysfunctional. It didn't work well. He had one son, Joseph, that he loved and treated better than the others, and that obviously caused problems with his brothers. The problems grew worse until they hated their brother. So in Genesis chapter 37, verse 18, when they saw him from a distance, now this is Joseph, his brothers saw him from a distance. When they saw him from a distance, and before he came to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, "Here comes the dreamer. Now then come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And we will say a wild beast devoured him. Then let us see what will happen to his dreams." But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, "Let us not take his life." Reuben further said, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit that it is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands." So, hands to restore him to his father. So, things had gotten so bad in Joseph's family that his brothers hated him so much that they made the decision to kill him. They threw him into a pit, and the pit didn't have any water. One brother, and it's interesting enough, this isn't the great-great-grandfather of Jesus. The brother that was the great-great-great-great-grandfather of Jesus was Judah. Reuben decided to talk them out of killing Joseph, and he made plans to rescue him later, but that wasn't going to happen. So they took Joseph and they threw him into this pit. And can you imagine what it was like for Joseph hearing this argument go on, an argument of whether his brothers should kill him or not? They threw him into the pit, and they made an awful decision. They decided not to kill him, but they decided to do something else. In verse 25, this is still Genesis chapter 37. Then they sat down to eat a meal. And as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming to Gilead with their camels, bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh, on their way to bring them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then some Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. What an awful thing. You know, a lot of times deep down in your heart, if you don't get along with your family, you think, well, my family does really love me inside, deep down. What was it like for Joseph, a young man of 17, and all of a sudden he could hear his brothers talking about murdering him? What was it like for Joseph when all of a sudden his brothers pulled him out of that pit and they'd made the decision to sell him to Ishmaelite traders? But the hand of God was here too. When you think of Jacob and his children, I want you to think of the beginning of the nation of Israel. And here God was moving his people to Egypt. Joseph was going to go to Egypt. And he was going to be sold as a slave in Egypt. And God was going to set his people free in Egypt. They would become slaves, but they would be set free. The story went on, and this is a wonderful story. And if you have time, go back and read the story of Joseph in a few chapters after 37. Go through them. It amazes me how forgiving Joseph was. Joseph grew to be an adult. He had to go to prison. He was a slave to Potiphar. He had to go to prison. He ultimately was restored, and he went from being a slave to a prisoner. And then because he interpreted the dream of Pharaoh, he became one of the most powerful people in Egypt, maybe the most powerful people in Egypt. And during a famine, his brothers came to him to buy food. And he revealed himself and told them that he was their brother that they sold into Egypt, into slavery. But they reconciled, and Joseph moved his entire family, his father Jacob, his brothers, his sisters, his descendants, moved them to Egypt. And that's how the Israelites got to Egypt. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. Now, all the Israelites moved to Egypt, and they had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. All of a sudden, they started to make this transformation from just a family to a tribe of people. Now, remember, ultimately, they were going to become 12 tribes, and ultimately, they would become a great nation. But they made this transformation from just a small family to this huge tribe of people, this huge nation within Egypt. And they became so successful and so multiplied so much that the Egyptians became afraid of them. In Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, now a king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more mightier than we. Come and let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply even, and in the event of war they will also join themselves to the ones who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land. So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made them their lives bitter, and hard labor in mortar and bricks, and all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. So Joseph's descendants settled in the land of Egypt. They were moved there because his brother sold him into slavery, but then he became the most powerful person in Egypt, and Pharaoh, because of the blessing of Joseph, gifted him this land of Goshen for his family. So they were so successful and so proliferous and so successful that they became a huge tribe of people, and the Egyptians became afraid of them. So the Egyptians persecuted them and made them slaves and made their life hard. And the more they persecuted the Israelites, the more they grew, the more successful they became. And Egypt passed terrible laws. First, they told the midwives to kill every baby boy that was born. And then the midwives refused. And then they made this law that they should throw their baby boys into the river and kill them. A young woman there had a baby boy, and she didn't want to kill him. She hid him for a long time. But then when the time came, she made a basket, filled it with pitch to make it waterproof, and put him into the river. There was one of Pharaoh's daughters there and found the basket and saved Moses. And Moses would become a great leader of his people. He was raised as a prince in Egypt, but he wasn't an Egyptian. He was a Hebrew. And by God's providence, remember his mother put him in the basket and set himself, but in God's providence, the Pharaoh's daughter who raised Moses like his child, like a son, chose Moses' mother as her nurse, his nurse. So Moses was able to know his family, to know his history, to know that promise. Remember that promise that God was building this great nation out of Abraham's descendants? That promise that God was going to build this great nation out of Abraham's descendants, and they were going to be a people, inherit a land, and become a nation? Because through God's providence, Pharaoh's daughter chose his mother, Moses would learn about all those things. The people of Israel cried out to God for deliverance, and they prayed for deliverance. And God sent them Moses. God spoke to Moses in a burning bush, and God sent Moses to set the Israelites free, to speak to Pharaoh. Pharaoh hardened his heart. God used Moses to prove to Pharaoh, prove to the Egyptians that the Israelites were something special, that God was something special. He turned the Nile River into blood. He made frogs come out, gnats, flies. He killed livestock. Boils developed on their skin. Hail, locusts came and destroyed their crops. There was darkness. And in the ultimate plague, the firstborn son died from every Egyptian family. But the Israelites were told to take a lamb, to take his blood and put it on their doorpost. And if they did that, the death angel would pass over them. That lamb, that blood was a picture of what was coming. Remember, there was this promise that a great Messiah would come, that from Abraham's descendants, all the people of the earth would be blessed. And here we have in the plagues that God told Moses to have the Israelites take this blood of a lamb and put it on their doorpost. That blood of that lamb was pointing to Jesus. And Moses led the Israelites to freedom. God split the Red Sea. The Egyptian army was chasing after them. God split the Red Sea. The Israelites walked out on dry land. And then God brought back the sea over the Egyptian army. And God led them to the promised land. But when they got there, the people were big and strong, and they didn't believe that they were strong enough to overpower them. And because they doubted, they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. So this family of Jacob became this tribe of people at first in Egypt. But in Egypt, they grew to this huge tribe, so huge that the Egyptians were terrified of them and persecuted them. But then God heard their prayers for deliverance, and they were set free. God sent the plagues and Moses and led them out. And they became a nation. At first, the nation was led by patriarchs. At first, the believers of God were led by patriarchs like Abraham, like Isaac, like Jacob. But then God sent Moses to deliver the people, to lead them out of slavery. And Moses led the people. And Aaron, his brother, was his spokesperson. At first, after this, God gave them the promised land. They went in and they conquered the peoples that were there, and they inherited this promised land. And at first, military leaders called judges ruled the people of Israel. And if you look at the book of Judges, you can see that. But then, after they were ruled by judges, they wanted to be a king like everyone else. And God said, kings aren't that great. They persecute you. They make your life difficult. But they wanted a king. So God gave them King Saul. But King Saul disobeyed God. And God replaced Saul with King David. And then King David's family was going to be the family that was subsequently always the king of Israel. And that was the family God chose, David's family, where the Messiah would come from. That family line would be the line of the Messiah. Let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 9. Now, if you remember the story, David became king, and David had addiction issues. He had addiction issues with women. He had addiction issues with other things, and he struggled, and he ended up committing murder, and he ended up committing adultery, and took Bathsheba as a wife, even though Bathsheba's husband was a general, and he had Bathsheba's husband Uriah killed in battle. He ended up marrying Bathsheba. Their baby that was the result of this adultery died, but they had another child named Solomon. And Solomon became king. Solomon asked for wisdom, and God gave it to him. But Solomon also married women that didn't believe in God, didn't follow God. And subsequently, Solomon's heart turned away from God. So now we had that Israel became this tribe of people in Egypt. They were taken out of Egypt. They became this moving nation of people as Moses led them through the wilderness for 40 years. They inherited, they conquered the lands. They had a nation. That nation was one nation and one kingdom. And the king was David and then Solomon. And in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 9, Solomon had married many women. He had addiction issues similar to his father's addiction issues. And I just want you to know, you can pass your addiction so easily on to your children. If there was any reason to overcome addiction in your life, realize that sparing the next generation the same pain is a wonderful reason to overcome addiction in your life. So 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 9. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon. Solomon married these women that didn't believe in God, and then he started worshiping their fake gods. He started putting fake temples in the land and idols on top of high places, and was doing those things that were evil. And in verse 9, now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and will give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of your hand of your son. However, I will not tear it away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So Solomon had done this thing. He was rebelling against God. He was worshiping fake gods. He married women that were not faithful. And they turned his heart against God, and he said, I'm going to take your kingdom away, and I'm going to divide it into two nations. But because I loved your father David so much, I'm not going to do it while you're alive. He said, but your child's going to be born, and the nation's going to be split in two. Most of the nation, the great majority of the nation, will go to someone else. But because of my promise, remember that promise? That promise to build a great nation, but also the promise that by him all the families of the earth would be blessed. By that promise that from David's family would come the Messiah. He says, I'm going to reserve Judah and also Benjamin. But I'm going to preserve Judah as a nation. And the rest of the country will be given to someone else. And from that, Judah was come the Messiah. Why did he preserve Judah? Preserve the family line of the Christ. Now this is a map of how the nation was divided after that. The nation was divided into two nations, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. They were divided in that next generation after Solomon. Israel, Rehoboam was the king of Judah, and Jeroboam was the king of Israel. Now they were separated and they still stayed faithful, but first Israel became very idealistic and their capital was Samaria. And then also Judah began to rebel against God. And the nations of God, Israel and Judah, were conquered. Israel was conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Judah was conquered by Babylon in 600 BC. So as we see what was going on, God was building a great nation. But remember, that purpose of that great nation wasn't just to be a country. The purpose of that great nation was to bring the Messiah into the world. And as it got close to the time for the Messiah to come, God allowed the nations to disappear. He told them that if they would be faithful, he would be faithful to them. But they weren't. They rebelled against God. They worshiped fake idols. And ultimately, they were destroyed and conquered. But a new nation was going to come. From that family line of the king of Judah was going to come a Messiah, Jesus Christ. It was prophesied that he would come. So when the nations quit, and what would ultimately, Rome would conquer all this land, and they would all be subjected to be subjects of Rome. But God was going to build a new nation. A Messiah, a new king, a direct descendant of David was going to come. And that was the Messiah that was promised, the spotless lamb, the lamb without blemish, that would save us from our sins, save all of humanity. By him, everybody would be blessed. So this is the history. We're getting to the point. Now God was going to send prophets into the nations of Israel and the nation of Judah to tell them how to recognize the Messiah when he came. But part of God was going to become incarnate on the earth, and Jesus was going to be born, and he was going to change the world to change us. We're going to stop there. We'll come back next week for Jesus for Newbies, Lesson 6, and we'll get into some of the prophecies. Thank you for joining us for Jesus for Newbies.
All who are thirsty, all who are weak, come to the fountain. Dip your heart in the stream of life. Let the pain and the sorrow be washed away in the waves of his mercy.